James T. Kirk sat in his captain's chair on the bridge of the Enterprise, one of the finest Galaxy-class vessels in Starfleet. He was drumming his fingers on the upholstered arm of his seat. "Why me?" he muttered aloud to himself. His science officer, Mr. Spock, raised an eyebrow. "Captain?" he queried. Kirk looked across at his first officer and smiled. "Sorry, Spock, I was thinking out loud, one of the first signs of madness, you know." "Really, Captain," said Spock. "Then 90% of this crew are certifiable as insane." "You're probably right, Mr. Spock, but I think we will keep it to ourselves." "It's just these latest orders which I've received from Starfleet Command," replied Kirk, banging his fist on the arm of the chair. "After we've finished exploring this sector, we are to rendezvous with the freighter Trident and beam aboard a number of ancient artifacts and devices which Starfleet have classified as extremely dangerous and transport them to the secure science research planet Icarus 7, where a team of scientists and psychologists are waiting to delve into the workings of the devices, to see what makes them tick, and if necessary destroy them if they are deemed unsafe." Spock bit his tongue and thought better than to ask the captain if part of the working of the machines were clockwork, which caused the ticking. Instead, he returned to his console and thought to himself that humans were totally illogical and irrational. Kirk continued, muttering aloud, "What do they think the Enterprise is? A cargo ship? There is a whole universe out there to explore. The Romulans are rattling their sabers again, and we are Starfleet delivery boys. Mr. Sulu, plot a course into the Omicron Nebula. We still have some real work to finish." The crew and the ship were 3 days into their mission when a further communication was received that the Trident was entering their region of space and that a Romulan warbird had been detected outside of the Beta Quadrant where their home planet was located, still many light years away from their position, but at warp speed the distance could be measured in days. Kirk leant back in his chair, cradling his head. "Mr. Sulu, plot a course to intercept the Trident." He hit a button on his console. "Transporter room, beam up Mr. Chekhov and the landing party, and tell the science crew to collect their findings and begin documenting them." He hit another button. "Scotty, how are the engines and defense systems?" A foreign accent came from the console. "Everything's fine down here, Captain. Just give me the word and I'll give you maximum warp speed. Also, all 12 phaser banks are at 100% and we still have 240 photon torpedoes." "Thank you, Mr. Scott. Stand by," said Kirk. The speaker came to life again. "Transporter room here, Captain. Everyone is safely back on board the Enterprise." Kirk pressed his console again. "Thank you, transporter room. Stand down." "Mr. Sulu, have you a course for me?" The helmsman replied, "Laden and ready to initiate, Captain." The captain looked around the bridge. "Let's get this over then," he said, nodding to Sulu. "Warp factor 3, estimated time of arrival, Mr. Spock?" He looked over to his science officer. 2 days, 4 hours and 8 seconds, Captain." 7 seconds, 6, 5, 4. "Thank you, Mr. Spock. I appreciate your precision," interrupted Kirk. The ship sped forward at warp 3. 27 times the speed of light. "You have the bridge, Spock," said the captain. "I'll be in my quarters if needed." He traveled down the turbo lift to his cabin where a lovely young lady was waiting outside. "Hello, yeoman," said Kirk. "Hello, Captain," said the lady. "Anything I can do for you?" She raised a questioning eyebrow and smiled sexily. Kirk smiled and said, "A coffee will do for starters, Janice, and then we'll see." The next morning the captain stamped onto the bridge. "I don't believe it, more new orders. Not only have we to collect a load of space junk, but now we also have to babysit a Dr. Mason, a leading psychologist and leading expert in alien artifacts." He has demanded a room next to, or even better, inside the cargo hold where the artifacts are to be stored. Spock turned in his chair. This is no problem, Captain. We have installed living quarters in cargo holds before when the situation demanded it. And I can see the logic of having an expert on the spot in case of unforeseen problems occurring. These relics are an unknown quantity. Okay, Spock, I'll leave you to organize the installation, answered the captain. 2 days and 4 hours later, the Enterprise met up with the freighter Trident. And the transfer of the objects to a secure holding area in Cargo Bay 2 was completed in less than 2 hours. The captain of the freighter seemed to be in a hurry to unload them. Ready to beam the doctor over now, said the freighter captain. Very well, said Kirk. I'll make my way to the transporter room and greet him personally. Him, chuckled the voice from the freighter. You couldn't be more wrong, Captain. The doctor is a her, very much a her. Kirk looked towards the heavens. Why? Why me? He looked towards Spock. You have the helm, Mr. Spock. He stepped off the bridge and entered a turbolift. Transporter room 2, he growled. He entered the room shortly afterwards and nodded a greeting to the transporter operator. Ready to transport on your command, Captain, said the crewman. Kirk nodded his accent, and the transporter pads began pulsing. The transporter shimmered and gradually a shape took form. A young lady with pouting lips and blue eyes looked around her. She had rich auburn hair piled high in the old Greco style with flowing ringlets. She was dressed in a kind of regulation uniform. The tight blue science uniform followed every contour of her gorgeous frame, finishing just above her knees. The scoop neck finished short of her breasts but showed off her magnificent neck to the world. Black tights adorned her legs and she wore calf-length patent leather boots with a 2-inch heel. Across her shoulders she carried the obligatory tricorder. Hello, Jim, the vision said. Remember me? Ahem, said the captain, on the pretense of clearing his throat. His mind was working overtime running through the letters of the alphabet. Mason, a Mason, B Mason, C Mason, D Mason. D, that's it, D Mason. Don Mason. It was an old and tried method which seldom failed him. Of course, Don, how could I ever forget you, said Kirk. Don smiled wryly. You didn't seem to have a problem at the academy. I honestly believed that you had true feelings for me, but now I realize I was being used all the time, someone to show off to the other students. You were my first and only lover, you know. I've never been with anyone else since, but you didn't even have the decency to say goodbye. You were there one day and gone the next. The realization washed over Kirk. This was one of the girls he had had affairs with during his time in the academy. A psychology student who even then was showing a natural talent at her chosen career, and everyone knew she would go far. They had romanced for 3 weeks, but she began taking the affair far too seriously, talking engagements and marriage and things. He had to get out of this predicament and fast. So when a position for a cadet came up aboard an engineering ship, he put his name down, got the position and silently slipped out of her life. I'm sorry, Doctor, lied Kirk, but an opportunity came up and I had to simply take it. You won't understand this, being a woman. If our positions had been reversed, you would have done the same thing. The doctor looked at Kirk and shook her head. Show me to the cargo bay. I need to check everything arrived in one piece. The two walked to the door, passing the transporter operator, who was unsuccessfully trying to stifle a giggle. Kirk looked at him furiously, and left the room hurriedly. Follow me, Doctor, said Kirk as they reached the turbo lift. They entered and Kirk said, Cargo Bay 2. He stood in embarrassed silence as the decks flashed by, staring at the ceiling. The doors opened and she shook off his guiding arm and entered the cargo bay. "Where are my quarters, Captain?" she inquired. "Over there, Doctor," he said, pointing to a door in the corner. "We have installed quarters actually inside the bay, so you will be able to keep an eye on the items all the time, or if you prefer This will be fine, Captain," she cut in, after opening the door and looking inside. Kirk meanwhile was looking at the various strange objects in the cargo bay. "I've never seen things like these before. Are you sure that they are safe? Do you know what they are, and what they do?" "Mostly I do, Captain. After all, I do specialize in ancient remains and relics." Her demeanor had softened. This was her subject after all. She pointed to a round sphere. "This is believed to be a cloaking device, similar to the one developed by the Nasdaq. It was found in the midst of wreckage from an unknown vessel in the Sigma Quadrant." They moved further into the bay. This apparatus came from the dead planet Camus 2. In their efforts to save their race from a plague, they built several of these. "This is the only surviving one," she said, pointing at what appeared to be a 6-foot-long, 8-foot-high wall with 2 smooth concave areas cut into the face of the wall and a number of levers and buttons to the left side. Kirk touched the face of the wall. It felt warm, and if he wasn't mistaken, there was a humming from deep inside. "What was the purpose of the apparatus?" he asked the doctor. The doctor replied, "These are mind transference units. As I stated, the Kame were a dying race, and they built these to transfer healthy minds from dying scientists into still healthy people in the hope that they would then be able to find a cure for the epidemic which was sweeping their planet. But unfortunately, it was too little, too late, for the Kame." Interesting," remarked Kirk. "So if the two minds had to coexist in one person, which one was the more dominant?" "Good question, Captain," commented Dawn. "I cannot be certain, but logically the new mind ought to be the stronger of the two." Kirk moved over to a square object floating 6 inches above the ground, enclosed inside not one but several force fields. "And this?" he inquired. "We believe this is an advanced weapon, although we are not certain. When it was first found, it was transported aboard the cruiser Excelsius. When the ship arrived at its base, the vessel was being totally manned by the women of the crew. All the men were gone. They reported that the cube had traveled silently throughout the ship, and every male it came into contact with was turned to dust, whilst the women were ignored. This leads us to believe that it was designed to annihilate the warriors, whilst retaining the women as slaves or breeding stock," said Dawn. They moved on to what looked like a round chamber with a dentist chair in the center. Above it was what appeared to be a tube with a crystal on the end. A control table was sited in front of a large observation window built into the chamber, through which the chair could be plainly seen. "Now, being a psychologist, this is my favorite piece of apparatus," said the doctor. "It was found on Tantalus V, a prison planet for the insane. The director of the facility had installed it for the treatment of the criminally insane. He called it a neural neutralizer. With it, he was able to wipe or alter memories. It could literally rewrite the minds of patients, but an accident occurred and he was found in the chamber, his mind a total blank." "I've seen enough, Doctor. Now I understand why the captain of the Trident was in such a rush to offload these things," remarked Kirk. "Unfortunately, I must get back to the bridge. Is there anything further you require?" "Nothing, Captain. Please excuse me. I also have something to do." But the door had already closed behind the captain as he departed. "Once again, I don't deserve a goodbye," she thought to herself. She entered her cabin and lay stretched out on the bed staring at the ceiling. What was it the captain had said in the transporter room? He wished that he could have changed places with her at the academy. Now there's a thought. She chuckled wickedly and snuggled down the bed, closing her eyes, a devious, wicked smile on her face. The following morning she was up and about early, checking on the contents of the bay, and was awaiting the arrival of the captain to begin her scheme. She had lain awake most of the night running her scheme over and over in her mind. The cargo bay door opened and the captain strode in. "Good morning, Doctor. I hope you slept well," he said. "Good morning, Captain." "Yes, I slept well," she replied. Walking over to the Camus artifact, she opened out a tape measure and began taking measurements, entering them into her tricorder. "Can I borrow you a minute, Captain?" inquired the doctor. She gave him the open end of the measure. "I need to check the height, to see if is constant." They took several measurements, and the doctor noted them down. "Now the width, Captain," she said. The captain stepped over to the right side of the apparatus and held the tape. "Just here, Doctor?" he asked. "That's good, Captain." She examined the tape and entered further readings. "Now could you hold it actually in the center of the hollow?" she asked. The captain stepped in front of the dished area and held the tape. "This okay, Doctor?" asked the captain. "Perfect, Captain, just perfect," said the doctor, stepping over to the other side of the device. She pressed a button on the controls, and instantly the area around Kirk became luminescent, and the hollow itself began intermittently glowing yellow, then fading to orange. The captain felt a sudden wrench and he was spun around and jerked backwards into the flashing cavity. His body was held rigidly against the walls by an unseen force, arms and legs slightly spread apart. His head held securely, his eyes wide, staring slightly upwards. The doctor stepped in front of him. "You said you wanted to exchange bodies. I am going to grant you your wish, Jim." Kirk attempted to reply, but even his mouth was held immobile. Dawn stepped out of his limited line of vision. He felt an intense probing in the very core of his mind. His vision swirled and he blacked out. The doctor stepped over to the controls and pressed another button, and the area around the other hollow began radiating. She pulled the bottom lever and the humming from deep inside the machine became more pronounced. The doctor stepped into the vacant cavity and leant over and operated the top lever. She arranged herself in the same attitude as Kirk and waited as the hollow began pulsing light. She felt her mind being probed and she too passed out. Unseen by the two, the machine worked on automatically. A glow began forming around each of the two, building up into a shimmering outline of each of the two figures. They grew in intensity, then slowly moved out, before crossing each other and settling over the opposite figure, where they dissipated into the unconscious bodies. The humming decreased and the lights dwindled down to nothing. Silence filled the cargo bay. Sometime later the doctor opened her eyes and shook her head to clear the fog. Her head ached and she felt a little queasy. Stepping away from the machine, she staggered. She felt different. She looked down over her body, now clad in a Starfleet captain's yellow uniform. It worked! "I'm in James Kirk's body, I am a man," thought a triumphant Dawn. "How powerful I feel." She flexed her new muscles. "I was correct in my assumption. All my memories and the persona of Dawn Mason are in here, totally overwhelming and controlling the captain's personality." She looked across to the still unmoving figure of the female figure held immobile by the machine, so she should have Kirk's memories in her head dominating mine. The next part of my plan will hopefully alter this. Stepping to the controls, he moved a lever and the limp figure of the doctor slowly slumped forward into his waiting arms. He swept her up and carried her, once again astounded by his newfound strength. He carried her into her quarters and laid her gently upon the bed and removed her communication badge. Her head fell to one side on the pillow, her hair falling like a halo around her face. He disappeared into the kitchen and replicated a beef burger and chips. He was famished, and devoured it in a matter of minutes. He would never have dared to eat such a meal in his old female body. It would have gone straight onto her hips. He gulped down a large beer and belched loudly, chuckling. Got to play the part now I'm a male, he thought. Just then a moan came from the other room, and he returned to find the captain staring about herself uncomprehending. What has happened to me? She strained to sit up on the edge of the bed. Struggling to catch her breath, she squealed girlishly as she noticed her attire. My voice is different, it's high-pitched, and I'm wearing a female science officer uniform, she thought. Leaning over, she pulled off her boots. My feet are tiny, and my legs have become shapely and long, and I am wearing black tights. She ran her hands over her once muscular body, following the new curves of her hips and waist. She cupped her breasts. What on earth has happened to me? A doubt crossed her mind and her delicate hands fluttered to her groin area. A look of horror crossed her face, and she licked her lips nervously, tasting lip gloss. I'm a female, I'm definitely a female. Somehow I have been transformed into a woman. She felt her face, her cheeks, her long fluttering dark eyelashes, and painted eyelids, her alluring deep blue eyes. She grasped a ringlet of hair and pulled it forward so she could see the red-brown strands. Looking up, she noticed the man smiling down at him. Gorgeous, aren't you, Doctor? Said the figure of Kirk. Who are you? What's happened to me? Help me up, please. I must see Spock. Her voice came out soprano. Sorry, Jim, or should I say Dr. Mason? I can't allow that. I am not ready to let you loose around the ship yet, said the figure of Kirk. Kirk to bridge. The girl on the bed tapped her breast where the comm badge should have been. Damn you. The man opened a case on the table and removed a hypo spray and looked back at the woman on the bed who was still staring down at her mini-skirted body and touching her breasts, a confused frown on her face. Stepping up behind her, he pulled her head to one side and placed the spray to her neck. The tranquilizer permeated her skin and coursed throughout her body. She sagged limply and fell back onto the bed in a deep sleep. Can't stay to chat, Doctor, I've a starship to run, said the new captain and made his way to the bridge. Stepping onto the bridge, Kirk felt completely at home. Status, Mr. Spock? Everything proceeding as expected, Captain, answered his first officer. Excellent, arrival time at Icarus 7? Mr. Chekhov. We're proceeding on schedule, Captain. At this speed we will arrive in 4 days and 9 hours, said the helmsman. Any sign of the Romulans, Mr. Sulu? No, Captain, they have returned to the Beta Quadrant, answered the second helmsman. The remainder of the morning was spent on the mundane running of the ship, and nothing untoward was happening, so the captain said, You have the bridge, Mr. Spock. I'm going to check on our guest and her playthings. He disappeared to the turbo lift. Arriving at the cargo bay, he went to the doctor's quarters and remarked to the still unconscious figure, We cannot have you running around the ship saying that you are the real Captain Kirk, can we, Doctor? So I must implement stage 2 of my plan. He lifted the form from the bed and carried her out to the bay. Her arm fell naturally around his neck. We will have time for that kind of thing later, my darling. First you have an appointment with a friend of mine from Tantalus V. He carried her into the chamber and draped her gently into the chair, strapping her wrists to the arms of the chair and pulling a strap tightly below her breasts. Can't have you running away when I awaken you, Doctor, said the man. Kirk exited the capsule and examined the control desk. He then returned to her quarters where he loaded another hypo spray. He returned to restrained figure, her head slumped to her chest. He moved it to one side and administered the antidote. He went out and stood by the control desk watching her as she quickly regained consciousness. After a few minutes she was looking around her, straining against the restraints. "Hello, Dr. Mason, and goodbye, Captain Kirk," the man said into a microphone. His words reverberated around the capsule. He turned one of two dials on the panel and the tube above the chair began flashing myriad of flickering lights over the chair. Her head fell back and her body relaxed, her eyes staring vacantly into space, her mouth relaxed, open, a small sliver of saliva rolled down her chin. Kirk turned the second control, focusing the lights into a narrow beam onto the center of her forehead. He held a microphone to his mouth. Smiling, he began speaking. "You are Dr. Dawn Mason. You have no recollection of being the captain of a starship. You could not be the captain because you are Dawn Mason. You have no memories of being Kirk, only memories of being Dawn Mason. All the memories of you being Kirk are diminishing away, fading into nothingness, becoming less and less, smaller and smaller, disappearing from your mind as though they never existed." The captain continued. "As the memories of being James T. Kirk fade from your mind, so your memories of being Dawn Mason increase and intensify, filling your mind, becoming stronger and more lucid. You are Dawn Mason, a top Starfleet psychologist. You are also a beautiful woman with all of her womanly desires. James Kirk now only exists in your mind as the object of your infatuation. You love Captain James T. Kirk. You've always lusted after Captain Kirk. You will do anything for Captain Kirk. The only memories you now have of the captain are pleasant, often erotic ones. You have no memories of being Captain Kirk. All memories of you being Kirk have now been erased." He increased the intensity of the beam. The woman in the chair screwed up her eyes in agony as the beam bored into her very psyche. You are a beautiful woman with all of her womanly desires. You are Dawn Mason, a psychologist. You dream of being the lover of James Kirk, of fulfilling his every desire, his every wish. The doctor turned up the intensity to maximum and the lights grew even brighter as the beam flooded her mind, deleting memories of being Kirk and creating and enhancing others of being Dawn. Her forehead creased as lights and sounds twinkled and crackled deep in her brain. Chemical changes were taking place in her brain nerve cells. Synapses were being activated as changes occurred in the neurons. Kirk continued, "You will remember this. I am Captain James T. Kirk, you are Dawn Mason, and I have always been Captain James T. Kirk. You have always been Dr. Dawn Mason." He noticed her eyes had closed and her head had lolled to one side. "Enough for your first session. The beam is more powerful than I thought." He unstrapped the figure and carried her over his shoulder back to her cabin. She came around a while later and stood up shakily. The captain walked in carrying a tray of food and wine. He placed it on her lap and she ate and drank greedily. "We'll have to improve your table manners, young lady," thought the captain. When she'd emptied the plates he went to take the tray, but she was watching him lustily, and when he was in reach she pulled him onto her, pressing her lips onto his. She broke away and locked eyes with the man. "I can't understand what's happening to me, Jim. Every cell in my body aches for you, my heart is fluttering like a young girl's. I need to be with you, but something is nagging at me. This should not be happening. It's not right. Hush, my dear, you must sleep now, ready for tomorrow," said the captain. He pushed her away and went to the table, returning with something hidden behind his back. She leant up on her elbows and he kissed her on her lips, bringing the hypo spray to her neck. "Good night, doctor." She collapsed in a heap. "Sleep well. I'll be here when you awaken." He then retired to his quarters for the night. The crew knew if anything demanded his attention he would respond instantly. He awoke early and showered and dressed. He still had a lingering desire to wear sexy, silky feminine clothes and perfume his body, but managed to fight the desire and keep it under control. He spent the next morning on the bridge, as the arrival at Tantalus V was now 2 days ahead and preparations were being made already for the arrival there. There was concern about a loss of contact with the distant Trident. It should still be within sensor and transmission range. He left the bridge after carrying out all of the usual demands of the captain, leaving Communications Officer Uhura with instructions to keep trying to contact it on all frequencies and for Spock to scan the region with long-range sensor sweeps. Returning to the cargo bay, he found Dawn was still comatose, and he administered the antidote. She came round almost instantly, and as soon as her mind cleared she was upon him, kissing his face. He savored the taste of her lips and took her by the hand. "Come, my darling, I need you to come with me." Willingly she followed him out of her quarters. He noticed she still had a quite manly strut as she walked. They walked to the neural neutralizer and he smiled to her and he bid her enter and sit in the chair. She nodded, entered and took the seat, straightening her dress as she made herself comfortable. He stepped outside to the desk and she waved to him smiling. He turned the first dial, her eyes became blank and stared into emptiness. He focused the beam onto her head with the second dial. She stared vacantly into the distance, her mind waiting for new memories to be created. "You are Dawn Mason, you have always been Dawn Mason. You love to wear feminine clothes and makeup. All your mannerisms are feminine, all your masculine traits and mannerisms are gone. You now walk with a feminine gait which shows off your sexy body. You love being a woman. When you look into a mirror you see a sexy, vibrant female reflected. You have a marvelous body and you desire to take care of it." He increased the intensity of the beam. "Your one and only love is Captain Kirk. You like wearing clothes to please him and wearing makeup and perfumes he likes. When you are out with him you are the perfect female, with immaculate manners and conduct. When you are in bed with him you become the perfect lover. Your desire is only to please him as only you can. Take him to the limits of ecstasy and pleasure. You love the captain. You adore the captain. You worship the captain." He turned the beam dial to maximum, her face contorted as she recoiled from the intensity of the beam. His final words sank deep into her cerebral cortex. "I am Captain James T. Kirk, you are Dr. Dawn Mason. I have always been Captain James T. Kirk. You have always been Dawn Mason." He watched as she writhed in the chair. "Remember this. Remember this well." He paused, then continued slowly. "You are Dr. Dawn Mason, you have always been Dr. Dawn Mason, a leading Starfleet psychologist. You are a beautiful woman, with all the charms and desires of a woman." She appeared to be on the verge of passing out, so he turned off the beam and let her rest for a while, as he reset the controls of the now seemingly innocuous neural neutralizer. She regained her strength surprisingly quickly, and was looking about her when he next glanced up. She looked at him through the observation window, a puzzled expression on her face. He motioned her to come out of the device and join him. She rose elegantly and walked to him. With every step her movements became more graceful, until by the time she reached him she was walking straight-backed, hips thrust slightly forward, swishing from side to side. Her stride had shortened and she was placing each foot in front of the other in the classic feminine gait. She linked her arm into his and sashayed femininely from the chamber, her head resting coyly on his shoulder, her eyes shyly looking up into the captain's. A greedy, doting look on her face, she licked her lips seductively and gripped him even tighter. Upon reaching the doctor's quarters, he gently lowered her into an armchair, saying, "I have to go to my quarters to change. When I return I'll make us a drink. What do you fancy?" "I'd like something long and warm inside me, Captain," she replied with a twinkle in her eye. "Can you manage that?" He chuckled. "Just you keep your engine ticking over, darling, I won't be too long," and strolled off in the direction of the turbolift. Dawn looked around her, still disorientated, as the newly created memories clicked agonizingly slowly into place, her mind gradually adapting her into the persona of Dr. Dawn Mason. She stood up and caught her reflection in a mirror. "Is that me?" she gasped. "I'm bloody gorgeous, a real femme fatale." She examined her reflection, first turning one way and then the other. She then struck a pose with one hand on her hip and the other behind her head, watching as her showboating image followed her every action. It pursed its lips and blew a kiss towards her. Her hands followed all the contours of her body, her hips, her thighs, her waist. They then wandered to her buttocks, and she gently grasped them, noting how shapely, firm and well-toned they were. Her hands strayed upwards, cupping her breasts, squeezing them and rousing the nipples with small circular motions of her thumbs. "Oh my," she thought. She became aware of a licentious desire spreading deep inside her body, and an image of the captain entered her head. She smiled and closed her eyes, delighting in the feeling as it flooded through her entire body. Beads of perspiration appeared on her brow. Her hands drifted down to her aching loins, her fingers probing and stroking through the fabric of her uniform. The pleasure increased tenfold, then 20-fold, and her breaths came in labored gasps. She suddenly squealed in delight and shuddered as a tremor shook her body and a wet patch appeared, staining the garment. She hung her head, one hand supporting her on the wall, trying to catch her breath. "Oh no. He can't see me like this," she thought, looking at her disheveled image in the mirror. "I must take a shower and change my clothes." She stripped of her soiled uniform and luxuriated in the hot shower, the water washing away all of her shameless thoughts as it cleansed her body. She washed her hair and gave it a deep conditioning. Then soaped her entire body, and basked in the sensations as she sponged herself, watching as all her lusts disappeared with the water down the drain. She slowly turned beneath the pulsing shower, letting it massage every inch of her body. After toweling herself dry, she donned the dressing gown provided and slipped into her bedroom. She picked up a clothes catalog from the magazine rack, looking through it bewildered. Once again the memories of Dawn fired up in her dormant brain cells, and she began to select her outfit from the many illustrations. Stepping to the replicator, she ordered panties, silk, white, size 30 inches. Page 42-inch brassiere, silk, white, size 32 inches. Page 119. Stockings, light brown, medium. Page 323. Backless evening dress, cream. Page 662. Shoes, black, 3-inch heel. Page 486 inches. An afterthought, she asked for a bottle of Shalimar by Guerlain. Complying, stated the machine, in a feminine voice. 6 packages appeared one by one, and she placed them on her bed. Moving to her dressing table, she sat and studied her face and hair. Picking up a brush, she brushed her hair, and it fell lightly onto her shoulders. At a loss at what to do next, she fastened it back into a simple ponytail. Opening the cosmetic tray, she stared at the perplexing array of powders, colors, crayons, pencils, and brushes. She selected various shades and began painting her face. 5 minutes later, she was cleaning the entire makeup off. "I looked like something from a horror movie," she thought. She stared once again at the selection of objects and colors. "I'm a woman. I must have done this thousands of times," she thought. "Why is it so confusing now?" Just then memories of Dawn applying cosmetics began firing in her mind and clicking into place. "Of course," she thought. "It's so simple." She squeezed a little nude fluid foundation onto the back of her hand and dipped a large brush into it, then applied it to either side of her nose, the apples of her cheeks, and around her mouth, spreading it evenly. Taking a black eyeliner pencil, she drew a line at the base of her eyelashes. Then took a palette of silver gray eyeshadows, applying them to the entire eyelid. Each of the colors was a little darker than the previous. The last she dabbed using her finger along the lash line to give a smoky shimmering effect. She then took mascara and applied it to her lashes, lengthening and curling and volumizing her lashes. Blusher was then brushed onto her cheeks, nose and forehead and chin. She outlined her lips with a pencil before using a lip brush and pink shimmer lip gloss to fill in the outline. Finally, she applied a matching pink nail polish to her fingernails and toenails. Shaking her hands and fingers, drying them into an ultra shine. Turning to the packages. She opened the silken panties, stepping into them and pulling them on with a wiggle. The bras followed. She fastened them with a little difficulty, then shook her breasts into them. The third package was opened to reveal the stockings, which she placed onto each foot in turn, stretching at her leg and unrolling them slowly up the length, smoothing them out as she went, the special tops adhering snugly to her thighs. She then opened the largest parcel and gasped as she saw the stunning gown. She stepped into it and pulled the straps into place. She did a twirl in front of the mirror. Undoing the last parcel revealed the shoes. She sat and inserted her feet and stood up, wobbling and rocking on the heels. At first she practiced walking in them and, unaware of the memories of walking in stilettos were already slotting into place. She picked up the final parcel and removed the protective packing to reveal her favorite perfume. She applied it to her wrists and neck. Instantly the seductive, sensual, flowery oriental bouquet she loved emerged, highlighting her delicate sensuality. Just then the captain returned carrying a bottle of the finest Arderian wine. He entered the kitchen and returned with 2 glasses. After popping the cork, he poured the golden liquid into each, handing one to Dawn. His eyes devoured the vision in front of him, and realized that, unplanned as it was, he was falling in love with the woman opposite him. He took a sip of his wine and placed the glass down beside him. Reaching over, he took her hand and pulled her towards him, leaning over to kiss her shining lips. Their lips locked, and for an eternity they were in their own world of pleasure. Bridge to captain, please come to the bridge, captain. He sprang up and stabbed at his comm badge. Captain to bridge, on my way. Dawn looked at him, her face flushed with desire. Sorry, my dear, this appears to be an emergency. He kissed her forehead. He stepped onto the bridge seconds lately. Situation, Mr. Spock. We've located the remains of the Trident, sir, but they managed to send a distress call before she was destroyed. He pressed a button and a voice said Trident to Enterprise. We are under attack from a Romulan warbird. They don't care that we are unarmed. We are damaged in all areas and cannot stand another ATT. The voice abruptly ended. Kirk looked to his science officer. Opinion, Mr. Spock. At the warbird's maximum warp, she could be ahead waiting for us fully cloaked. Their weapons are superior to ours, and we cannot locate them on the sensors until they uncloak. Then I fear it will be too late. Any suggestions, gentlemen? He said to the bridge crew in general. Nothing was forthcoming. I think we need to play a game of poker with the enemy. Keep scanning, gentlemen, he said. He leant forward, stroking his chin deep in thought. I believe this is a case of 2 heads being better than 1. He stabbed at the intercom. Dr. Mason, I may need your help. Please come to the bridge at once. The doctor looked at her flowing gown and thought. I have no time to put on my uniform. I'll have to go dressed like this. She swayed to the turbo lift. Bridge, she said. The lift began its ascent. 20 seconds later, the doors opened onto the bridge. A gasp issued from the crew members as Dr. Mason stepped out, looked about the room, and seeing the captain in his chair, walked to his side. You asked for my presence, sir, she remarked. He looked at her and thought, just a few days ago you would have been sat in this chair, controlling this mighty starship. Now you have become my lover. He shook himself, clearing his head. He explained their predicament to her and told her of his plan. She nodded her agreement and departed the bridge for the cargo bay. "Uhura, give me wideband transmission on all frequencies," said the captain. "All frequencies open, Captain," she answered. "Enterprise to Romulan warbird, why are you skulking in the dark like Klingon? Show yourselves, like true warriors." To be compared to a Klingon was the biggest insult one could give to a Romulan. Transporter room. "Lock onto the floating object in the force fields beside Dr. Mason in Cargo Bay 2 and stand ready for coordinates, Captain," came the reply. "Dr. Mason, is everything prepared?" "Yes, sir." "Anything on the sensors, Spock?" Kirk asked. Spock peered into the viewer. "Nothing, Capta. Wait, sir, a warbird is uncloaking at coordinates 0046398 and firing up their weapons." "Transporter room, lock onto the coordinates 0046398 and await my orders," Kirk said. "How many women are in the crew of the warbird?" Kirk asked Spock. "Sensors indicate an all-male crew, sir." "Transporter room, initiate," ordered Kirk. "Enterprise to warbird commander. Stand down your weapons and prepare to surrender or we will release our secret weapon," said Kirk. He looked across to his communications officer. "Anything, Uhura?" "No response, Captain." Suddenly the ship shook as an energy beam wiped out the main shields. "Sulu, lower the force fields around the weapon and get us away from here, warp 8, ordered Kirk. The ship leapt forward. "Any sign of pursuit, Chekhov?" asked the captain. "None, Captain, they are simply sitting there," replied the helmsman. "Then continue our course to the planet Icarus 7, let's finish this mission." He thumbed the intercom. "Scotty, what's the damage to the shields?" "Minor, Captain. Their blast shorted the main generator. It will be up and running inside 2 hours, said the engineer. They arrived at the planet and Dr. Mason supervised the unloading of the artifacts to the surface under the watchful eye of the captain. The doctor did not stay on the planet. She requested a place in the crew of the Enterprise, stating that she would achieve most satisfaction serving underneath the captain. The captain ordered the Enterprise to head back to the Romulan vessel and stop at the maximum transporter limit. Spock did a scan and reported there was no crew on board. Lock transporters onto the weapon and send it to the limit of our phasers. We don't want that thing anywhere near us, it's too dangerous. The square object was transported light years out into space. Spock was peering at it using the sensors. Captain, the weapon appears to have noticed us, and is beginning to head towards the Enterprise at increasing speed. I suggest the phasers be deployed now. How long have we got, Spock, before it reaches the Enterprise? Asked the captain. At its present increase in velocity, less than 12 minutes, Captain. Forget the phasers, lock a full volley of photon torpedoes on it. Said Kirk. Maximum spread. The ship shook as each torpedo was deployed, disappearing into the blackness, towards the target. The crew waited on the bridge with bated breath, looking at each other. Suddenly the darkness was lit by an incandescent light as the torpedoes found their target. Kirk shouted into his comm badge. Engine room, get us out of here, now, he continued. All crew brace yourselves. The shockwave caught the ship, tossing it like a cork on a stormy ocean. The helmsman fought to regain control, and loose objects flew around the bridge. Thankfully, after a few seconds, which seemed like days to the crew, the wave passed and the ship steadied. Damage report all decks, said the captain. The various decks reported several minor injuries to the crew members, and amazingly no major damage to the ship. Any sign of the weapon, Spock? Asked the captain. Totally atomized, Captain. Let's hope that was the only one in existence. The warbird was towed to the nearest Federation planet for the scientists to dissect and learn its secrets. Kirk resumed the previous interrupted mission and headed back to his quarters. He opened the door and Dawn sashayed towards him sexily, smiling and biting her bottom lip. She was barefooted, wearing a daring baby doll which clung enticingly to her body. Her hair was now flowing over her shoulders and her sensual perfume reached his nose. Her delicate painted fingers searched for his uniform fasteners and she kissed him, pulling his head down onto hers with one hand whilst delving into his pants with the other. "Energize, Captain," she whispered,